Thank you. And perhaps I'll kick us off. Shall I? I've just gone over 3:05.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody to the Dementia Knowledge Network for the month of August. Our meeting is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners on the lands of which we meet. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'll throw to Sarah to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Our speaker this afternoon is Jo McAuliffe. Jo's a level 2 and 3 support coordinator working in the NDIS and has worked since its rollout in 2017. She's recently worked closely with the NDIS diversionary branch YPRIAC, Young People in Residential Aged Care, and is happy to share her insights into how the NDIA can support people with young onset dementia. So welcome, Jo. We love an informal chat. We'll hand it over to you, and I'm sure people will have lots of questions as we go along.
Hi everyone. I'm actually becoming quite overwhelmed when I see the little, I think I see a Villa Maria person, a VMCH, sorry, and you guys are probably working all for organisations that I've met with over the years. I was a local area coordinator when NDIS rolled out in 2017, and it was in its very early stages. So back then they used to pay for corporate trainers to come out and train us in all things NDIS back when the scheme had a lot of money. So some things like access to the scheme I sort of know inside out because it was drilled into me. And since then, I've been an LAC and a support coordinator, but really most of the knowledge and my information that I wanted to chat about today was just that I've had a couple of recent participants in my caseload where I've had to navigate some pretty complex systems in order to get the correct funding for those people in their positions, both with young Alzheimer's. So age 56 and 58. And then I guess coming into today to talk to you, I was just going to, it's really interesting and unclear for a lot of medical professionals. So in the NDIS, as you would know, we always talk about mainstream supports or mainstream medical and then NDIS supports. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of providing support as a support coordinator is I have to link the two systems and they don't speak to each other. So I don't know if this is your experience or not. Mainstream medical would be psychiatrists and geriatricians and something like the older adult mental health service at William Angliss Hospital. So, psychiatrists and mental health workers, they sit in the mainstream space. And then NDIS is totally different. We've got occupational therapists, behaviour support practitioners, support coordinators, some nurses, and I guess that's been my challenge is to get information from mainstream medical for NDIS purposes. So someone with a diagnosis might go first to their GP, and then they'll get referred to a geriatrician or a neurologist, or a psychiatrist, depending. And then somewhere along the lines, one of those medical professionals or even DSA, so Dementia Support Australia, might mention, oh, did you know that you could go on the NDIS with this condition? And the family will be like, no, we thought that was for people with disabilities. We don't know anything about that. So then their challenge is to try and access the NDIS. And if the participant does gain access, the support coordinator will go along and get all these lovely new professionals on board, an OT, a speech therapist, behaviour support, support workers, all these people, but they're not talking to the mainstream medical at all, and there's no way of sharing information. So I guess one of the things I've had to overcome is trying to work out how you resolve that or get over that barrier so that the person's supported and the family feel like they know what's happening, because that's been my experience, is that the poor family and the poor person with the diagnosis has no idea what's going on and who makes decisions for them, who's going to support them in all aspects of their life. Yeah, I guess that can be broken down into the access issue. So Sarah, you did email me earlier in the week that someone that you know was having issues with access to the NDIS. And then once you do get your funding, there's an issue as to whether the LAC or the local area coordinator who's done your planning meeting has any knowledge of dementia at all. Generally, they won't, because they're not specialists in any field. So then really the family are just left to struggle. And then if the person is quite complex and their behaviours are progressing, then they really should be on the complex team, which is the young people residing in aged care team, or there's no nice way of saying this acronym, YPIRIAC team. And that turns them into a complex NDIS participant. And that's a diversionary team for anyone under the age of 65 at risk of a long-term hospital admission or entering aged care. And that team is pretty amazing in my experience. So within days of being granted access to that team, we had our own NDIA planner assigned to us. They really don't want the participant to go into aged care or hospital. So they basically throw money at the problem and will approve SIL funding for supported independent living, nursing assessments, OT assessments, assessments for SIL and SDA, in order to keep that person at home if that's their wish, or just out of hospital or out of aged care. And that diversionary team was created after the Royal Commission into aged care. So they have managed to reduce, I think, young people entering aged care by something like 25% since this team started. Everyone's experience with the NDIS directly is different, but and part of that is the support coordination. Support coordinators and LACs aren't that knowledgeable about what teams are in the NDIS and what their supports are. But it is all on the NDIS website. So it sounds too good to be true, but all the information about how to access the NDIS actually is on the NDIS website. So Alzheimer's is a list 2 condition. So that means that if you are diagnosed with, look, there's a list, I'll read it out. Conditions primarily resulting in neurological impairment. So these are Alzheimer's dementia, HIV dementia, Huntington's disease, multi-infarct, oh, sorry, I didn't put my glasses on, dementia, Parkinson's disease, post-polio syndrome, and vascular dementia. Then other degenerative diseases of the nervous system, it's got Alzheimer's disease. So if you have a diagnosis from a mainstream medical practitioner of those, you should meet the access requirements for the NDIS. However, people do get confused. The access requirements for NDIS are quite different than to receive the DSP through Centrelink. So the DSP is primarily because you're unable to access employment activity. So it's really a different criteria than if you're trying to access the NDIS. So even though you do have a diagnosis from a medical practitioner of this list 2 condition, the medical practitioner would still have to give evidence that it is that condition is already impacting your daily functioning, that you will require disability supports. So it is on the website. It kind of explains it pretty clearly. It's different to the DSP. You have to say why you can't work to receive the disability pension. But to access the NDIS, they're looking at your functional impairment on a daily basis. So if you've got a diagnosis of early or young Alzheimer's, but you could still drive, you can still go to the supermarket, and it's safe to stay at home on your own, you may not meet access yet. So that comes down to a very good relationship with a geriatrician or GP who's going to be filling in your evidence for the NDIS access form. And if your access is denied, you have 100 days to request a review of that decision. And that's beyond most people though. Like, that's a really hard process to go through. There are a couple of advocacy organisations that will help you access the NDIS. Maroondah Council have an NDIS access coordinator. It's a free service at the council that she can help you access the NDIS. And some other councils do have them. You can also approach some support coordinators, mainly the independents, and they'll try and help you get access to the NDIS as well. Kind of like a handshake agreement, though. If they help you, then you'll sign on with them. But, you know, for some people, they can be helpful. So I'm losing my place. Is there any questions about the access that you're dying to ask or don't understand? Because I can sort of try and remember from when I was working for the NDIA.
I just wanted to ask, oh, sorry. Sorry, and you put your hand up and everything, Michelle.
No,
sorry,
that's
I
all good.
apologise. I was very rude.
Thank you, Rachel.
It's Rachel here from Dementia Australia. So we have a lot of issues around people that, I shouldn't say a lot of issues, but I've had people that actually are on the NDIS and are young onset and actually wanting to go into resi aged care because they can't find suitable.
Yes.
They've got the self-funding, but they can't find it in an appropriate house. And so therefore they're left in this limbo of being at home, but without, you know. So is there a way that there's someone that can help them to be able to get into resi aged care if that is what they want?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. We've got to talk about the NDIS has the choice and control factor in it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't use SIL funding. Aged care providers aren't supposed to take SIL funding, even though you should be able to use your own funding flexibly. Private nursing homes will take it, but if you've all had things to do with private nursing homes, there's not a lot of choice there around providers, and they don't have the same regulations as the big registered providers for aged care.
Yeah.
But are those people, do you know, already in the complex pathway with that?
I'm not sure. I've never heard of the complex pathway until you said it today. So I've never heard of it. But they definitely had SIL funding, and they definitely had housing funding, and you know, the funding for the carers 2 to whatever the ratio was. But they were unable to find appropriate housing for this person to go into. So yeah,
I had a participant move into aged care. In the end they just said, yep, they're supposed, that the team is designed to divert people away from aged care, but if the participant wants to enter aged care, they should be able to.
I mean, it gets to a point where it's hard to find carers in the NDIS that have a good knowledge of dementia and enough of them to have 24-hour care all the time. You know,
some of the barriers around providing support to people who are progressing is the restrictive practices are in place. So the people providing the care need to be registered to provide restrictive practice. So we're mechanical restraints, or environmental restrictions, like locking doors, and also medication, so antipsychotics and so forth, are restrictive practice. So larger like aged care facilities are registered to put those practices in place, because they have to report back to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission every month, and that's to prevent human rights abuse. So that's another reason why you wouldn't want to go into a little or a private nursing home, because they would not necessarily have those processes in place. But yeah, your participants. So I have had a participant of mine who entered aged care at 58, and they said fine. So they do a cross billing system with my aged care. So
was that recently, Jo? Or was that like a while ago?
It was last year.
Okay.
And she remained on both the NDIS and my aged care. So when she turns 65, she needs to choose which scheme she stays on. But she was able to.
Okay.
So
I haven't come across anyone being able to yet. So
yeah, so I think after this meeting, so there's quite a number of housing and accommodation advocacy services that you can access. So at that point where they're like, well, we've got the funding, but we want to go into aged care, they can choose to do so. So in my knowledge, so it might just be about what.
If you've got some of those housing people, could you email Sarah? If Sarah, you're happy to share that with us, that would
I'll
be
email some
fantastic.
resources. And also it just depends also on like the support coordinator in that situation. You do need to advocate at a high level. Like you really need to.
Yeah, a lot of it comes to the support coordinator, doesn't it? So,
I think so. Like, yeah, I think so. But also, if the guidelines were simple and simply stated somewhere, we could all refer back to them, right? But unfortunately, they're not. The guidelines about diverting people out of aged care are pretty clear. But also, a worst case scenario, I say with my families is a long-term hospital admission has such a huge impact on someone's health and well-being, and you want to avoid that at all costs. So that's another reason why the NDIS should be allowing people to enter aged care, because if a locked psychiatric ward is no place for anyone. You can avoid that. And in some cases, that's where people will end up if 000 is called or they present to emergency. They will be put into the mainstream psychiatric hospital care or rehab, which is not fantastic.
Well, it's horrendous. Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt. I just see Naomi's got her hand up, so I'll just go to Naomi.
Thanks. Hi, Jo. I was just wanting to clarify the diversionary team that you were talking about. Is that the BRAC team?
Yep. So I'm terrible at saying it. BRAC. Everyone's got a different way of saying it. And originally, I had no joy with them a couple of years ago. They were really unresponsive, and now I'd email them and they're responsive within like 2 days. And generally when I do contact them, I'll make sure I have an occupational therapy report for the person, a very recent one, or a functional capacity assessment, a change of circumstance or a change of situation form, which is saying why is it urgent that we're contacting this team. So what happens then is the intake person will see that there's been an urgent change of circumstance, and the team need to step in, or the person will be at risk of aged care or a long-term hospital admission. So then they get that information and triage it. If you just contact them with a general inquiry, I don't think they're as responsive. It really needs to be an action inquiry, like help us or this will happen. Yeah. So yeah, that's just about access. And then in terms of, so my families have chosen to keep their loved one or the person with the diagnosis at home as long as possible. Is that generally been the case that you've found, everyone?
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for the NDIS to cope with. And one of the reasons is that when someone's cared for in the home and there are these restrictive practices, so sometimes they're things that you wouldn't even think about, that you just do automatically. So if your loved one is at risk of absconding, you just lock the door, or, maybe hide the remote control of the telly, or, hide the knives away because, they might just get a bit confused. Whatever it is that you're doing, as a family member, you're allowed to do that. But once there's a behaviour support practitioner involved, they have to report back to the NDIS on all these restrictive practices if a provider is doing them. So if you've got Joe Blogg's nursing agency coming in 4 times a week and they have to do the medication and they've been locking the doors, then it opens up this whole realm of making it really difficult for participants to be cared for by agencies in home. It is to protect them, though, so I can understand why those frameworks are in place. But I was just hoping today to talk about some of the challenges, and that certainly has been a challenge I have found. because the NDIS, might allocate $300,000 for a person to be cared for in home by, agencies and other people. But then once these practices are identified, it really reduces the amount of providers you can look at, because not many providers are willing to come into the home to do that sort of support, or they're not registered to provide restrictive practices. So I did a big phone hunt the other day and didn't have much luck. So I've got a gentleman who has 30 hours a week of care in home. And at the moment, the NDIS Quality Safeguards Commission are aware that his providers aren't registered, but they're giving us a grace period where I transition to having all registered providers in home, which kind of sucks for the family because they would like to choose who supports them. So that's another little interesting place to navigate, and in a way making it difficult not to go into a SIL house or aged care, because if you can't choose who's supporting you in your home, what's the point of staying home? Do you know what I mean? Like it's a really difficult space to navigate. Again, had to do lots of learning about, but it is possible to care for people with dementia without using restrictive practices. So then, that's the thing. So then I talk about the role of the behaviour support practitioner. Does everyone vaguely know what a behaviour support practitioner is or does? So positive behaviour support has been around for quite a long time. And in the disability space, it's around, we used to call them behaviours of concern. So it's behaviours that would put someone at risk to themselves or others. So it could be verbal aggression, self-harm, absconding. There could be lots of different aspects to it. And since the NDIS started, they've sort of allocated funding for positive behaviour support, it's called. So it will be a package in your NDIS plan, and it can only be used for positive behaviour support, generally with a registered provider who's got a psychology and occupational therapy background and done a master's in behaviour support. And that person will come in and they're allocated a certain amount of money to create a behaviour support plan, which if you're the NDIS participant, this document follows you everywhere. So that lists all the triggers of your behaviour, behaviour management strategies. It lists any restrictive practice. And if you were, say, to go to short-term accommodation or respite, that document would go with you, so all the staff would understand more about you and what your triggers are and safety concerns, stuff like that. So I think for people with dementia, that's a pretty important document or a pretty important support to have included in your NDIS plan, and I would be asking that to be in my very first NDIS plan if I had any of those behaviours at all, because it's the support practitioner can work really closely with the family, like come in, and the role of Dementia Support Australia is to provide some strategies, but this goes to a whole nother level of support. Setting up daily routines, training staff, suggesting other supports or other activities that would be useful, and then also reporting back to the NDIS. But if you have any of those behaviours and you don't have that document, it's going to be really hard to get care as you progress, because if you're absconding or raising your voice and threatening people, things like that, you're not going to be able to get appropriate care because those are all risky behaviours. And with OH&S policies, organisations aren't going to take you on. And then again, your hospital is pretty much the only place where you'll be able to be cared for safely. So, the role of the behaviour support practitioner, it might not apply to everyone with the diagnosis, but I'm working with two gentlemen who do definitely have that presentation. very young, fit, active men who unfortunately are very confused a lot of the time. So yeah, I've had to do a lot of learning around how they can be supported. And again, they have a team, their own psychiatrists that are doing psychiatric care. They've also got a geriatrician doing not much, unfortunately, I don't think. And then a bunch of really good home support workers who are working with a behaviour support practitioner to understand how to support him, how to support them. Does anyone want to ask questions about behaviour support in the NDIS?
Do the behaviour support practitioners, do they work in conjunction with a treating psychiatrist in terms of formulating support plans and identifying triggers?
Absolutely. So I would like to see if they're involved and they're funded in a plan, they are like the care team lead, really.
Okay.
Yep. So that's definitely in their role to liaise with all the health practitioners. They need to be on top of what medications are happening. If there's PRN medications, so definitely work together. And some people won't have either of those things in terms of their support team. So if they could have one or the other, but behaviour support's really good thing to have because the funding is there. It's like 40 hours, it can almost be a weekly visit, which can be really helpful, definitely. And traditionally, the NDIS were only handing out behaviour support packages for people with the more traditional disabilities that NDIS always used to fund. And I don't think the NDIA have a lot of knowledge around dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's and neurological conditions because they always have sat with mainstream medical. So I think NDIA is slow to come on board with supporting other things.
And you've got to get in before the age of 65. I recently took on a new client who was actually diagnosed in 2015 with younger onset, but had absolutely no support, not referred to anyone, and now she's just needing full care at home with her husband, had a RAS assessment, and they didn't really do anything except send her to Donwood one day a week. And then I got involved and I escalated an urgent ACAS assessment. She's just been approved at a level 4 package, and I got her into Caledonia, and just the difference that's making in the sort of support of the husband especially. But yes, some of them can fall through the cracks actually.
Absolutely. And there's that lack of knowledge in what I call the mainstream medical, is that you can even be on the NDIS with these conditions. Like how old is she now, your client?
She's 71 I think now, but she was early 60s when an official diagnosis was given.
So that, I guess that was me just talking a bit. Hopefully it makes sense. So I've the behaviour support and the restrictive practices, it's all NDIS language, and it can be befuddling. And in some cases for you guys, you won't need to deal with any of it. It's just that I've had a couple in a row set this up. So in the case of the family who have got a lot of care at home, she's actually just been approved funding through this complex team of 24-hour care if required to keep him at home, which will make family life a lot different, obviously, for them as a family, but at least she has the choice then to keep him at home, which I think is fabulous.
Can I just ask, Jo, do you have to have challenging behaviours or behaviours of concern or whatever before you're entitled to get that?
So that support is one-to-one because of his challenging behaviours. But to access that team, no. You just have to be at risk of a long-term hospital admission or going into aged care. And I think once an OT's done an assessment, you'll find that the boxes get ticked and the OT will actually recommend a high level of support in their document. And it's just doing, if someone needs supervision, basically, to remain safe, that's an indication of aged care or 24-hour care, because it means that someone has to have their eyes on or be very near them in order for them to remain safe. So it doesn't mean they've got challenging behaviours. It could be that without prompting, they won't drink, eat, get changed, go to the loo, and they're all indicators that someone needs a high level of support. And that's why a good OT is very important, who has specific knowledge with neurological conditions, because at the moment there's been an influx of lovely occupational therapists who have just graduated, but they have a very generalist background. And I think it's really important to build a really good team with occupational therapists and speech therapists with your NDIS funding that have hands-on experience with young Alzheimer's or young onset dementia, because the challenges are so different because it is degenerative. And the same reasons I said, because they've slipped through a number of gaps with mainstream medical supports. Like, it would be lovely to be able to phone your geriatrician or your psychiatrist every week to get help, but you just can't, or your GP. So you really are relying on your allied health team for answers and support.
Can I ask how easy it is for people to find experienced OTs to, help them with the assessment?
Yeah, so you really need your support coordinator is working for you. So I say to everyone, fire your support coordinator and get a better one. There's heaps of people my vintage out there that have started their own companies, that are sole traders or just working 2 to 3 together. And the reason they've done that is because they're passionate usually about the NDIS and about being support coordinators. And a good place to find them might be on a Facebook page for NDIS providers, local to your area, word of mouth. Once you've got a good support coordinator, they probably have a little black book of good people. Do you know what I mean? And I mean, that's not easy to recommend to your clients, but there isn't there's a couple of organisations that are neuro specific. So neuro rehab, there's a couple that just do neurological conditions for occupational therapy, but I can put those on a list, but I probably shouldn't be seen to be recommending specific people. And then in that sense, if they do an assessment, they'll know which language to use. So I hate to say it, but you're only as good as your last occupational therapy assessment. There's so much weight given to that document with the NDIS. They actually have occupational therapists on their specialist teams that are approving assistive technology and housing decisions. So they're actually qualified OTs working for the NDIA. So then they really appreciate a really well-written OT report that addresses all the criteria of reasonable and necessary in their report. That's another thing the NDIS are always looking at. So a psychologist might write a support letter saying, Bob's at home, Bob's struggling, it's really impacting his mental health, blah, blah, blah. But the psychologist hasn't addressed the reasonable and necessary criteria, which is, why is this support best offered by the NDIS and not another funding body? Why is this support value for money? Is the support is the impairment lifelong? And so a good OT will address all those things when they're applying for funding or creating a report, and that's really an important thing to have as well. So in answer to your question, I encourage people to fire their lousy support coordinators and lousy OTs and get really good ones that know what they're talking about. That's half the battle won, especially with housing decisions. And advocating as well. And a good OT will sit in on the planning meetings and be the voice for the family, or a behaviour support practitioner will also sit on planning meetings. Yeah.
Oh, Naomi, did you have your hand up again, or was that from before?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, in terms of finding good OTs as well, on the OT Australia website, you can search for categories, and there is now finally a category for OTs that work with people living with dementia. So that could be another.
Oh, that's excellent.
Good
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and
That's
then also.
Yeah.
also there's a great program called the COPE program. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. So it's more about supporting the care partners of people living with dementia. It's an OT program. So if you go to COPE Australia or COPE program, you just Google that, you'll come up with the COPE program in Australia, and there's also a list of OTs that are trained in that you can search by area. So, you know, whether they are also good at, you know, the housing assessment kind of side of things as well. You can just ask them, but they might work in conjunction or they might do both. But
yeah. And that's a really good point. And thanks for that, because I hadn't heard of that or that COPE program. Sometimes it's good to have 2 OTs. So you can have one that's got a lot more availability and capacity to come out and do day-to-day stuff, like find a red hot toilet seat so no one can miss when they go to the loo, and have that delivered and installed. That's really important. But it's also really important to have someone who can do a housing submission or a full functional capacity assessment. So yeah, you can actually use your funding flexibly, and you can have multiple providers in the same space. It doesn't always work, but yeah, it can be a good workaround. Definitely. So what was I? So I've talked about the access to the NDIS. The only other criteria that you have to be under 65 and you have to be an Australian citizen is the other one. So some people do confuse the disability support pension from Centrelink with NDIS, and just because you have one doesn't mean you'll be able to get the other one. They're two quite different systems. And the other thing that people sometimes don't know is that the NDIA, it's not means tested. So that's pretty well known now, but people used to think that it was means tested, but it's not. So there's no financial criteria for accessing the NDIS. If you're allocated an LAC up front, which you probably will be if you access the NDIS, the local area coordination service are basically, so here it's La Trobe Community Health. They're basically the administrators of the fund locally for people that aren't complex or seen as complex. So I always say start off with the local area coordination service, but there's every chance a participant or a person will be complex and you just didn't know because you haven't been on the scheme for very long. So some of the things that make you complex is having dual diagnosis. So if you have other diagnoses as well, mental health diagnosis especially, if you've got a first language other than English, if you're also involved in the justice system or a victim of domestic violence, if you have frequent hospital admissions, if you have very few informal supports, if you're at risk of homelessness, they're all things that will make you a complex participant. And often, once you've gained access, the family may not have said all that stuff at the planning stage. So the NDIA only make decisions with information that they have. So don't assume they have information. If there's a TAC claim that's been had, there's a lot of things people don't think about when they try and access the scheme, but you want them to know how complex your situation is, because if there's multiple people in the house with NDIS funding, for example, or the primary carer has a disability or illness, it basically means that you'll be funded at a higher level, really, if they know that you're complex. So yeah, I would, and providing evidence around that is tricky, because sometimes it's like looking up old GP reports and psychiatric reports, or producing evidence of things that have happened, but I think it's worth it. And if you are at risk of aged care or long-term hospital admission and you are accepted by the I can't say it, team, then you don't have to provide any further evidence. They can also assign you an accommodation officer who will do what the support coordinator should be doing, and the accommodation officer will actually look for appropriate housing for you as part of that team support. I've had varying degrees of success. They're a busy bunch, the housing officers. So I found a support coordinator on the ground making a million phone calls is probably going to get a better result, but at least they're trying. And I guess that's all. So I was just going to throw it open to any questions. Hopefully I haven't been bumbling on and I've made some sense from an NDIS point of view. Yeah.
Rachel?
I just wanted to ask how frequently you can get reviews, because we'll have package and then they may deteriorate, and then it's sort of,
So I love reviews. Reviews are amazing. So they used to be called reviews and now they're called plan reassessments, which is just a bugger to say. So I'll just stick with reviews. You can have 1,000. Just keep going for it. Every time your circumstance changes.
So it's not 6 monthly or 12 monthly or
So
whatever.
you need to have a review date set. So recently, most people that don't have a degenerative disease or disability will be pushed to have a 3-year plan now. It was 1 year, it went up to 2. Now they love the 3-year plan. But in this category that we're talking about, 6 months, you can ask for a 6-month review, 12-month review, and they should say yes. But as soon as the circumstance changes and you have evidence of the change, then you can apply with a change of situation or change of circumstance form. They have 21 days to say yes or no to the review, and then 10 days to hold the review meeting. So if an example would be if the couple that I'm working with, if the wife suddenly had to have a hip operation and couldn't be the primary carer anymore, that's a change of situation, and I'd want his plan reviewed because she couldn't provide the support any longer, or she could only provide minimal support. So the support coordinator can do the paperwork, but if the participant's on their own, they can actually just phone the NDIS and say things have changed, I don't know what to do, and the customer service agent will actually lodge the review request for them on the phone. And there's guidelines around, and they're really trying to stick to their guidelines around timeframes at the moment with reviews. So the other type of review is our old S100, which is a review of a reviewable decision. So if you don't like a decision the NDIS has made, you have 100 days to dispute it. And that's another form that you lodge, an S100 form, oddly. And that could be that you went into the planning meeting all gung-ho going, yeah, we're going to have OT, we're going to have speech therapy, we're going to have this huge budget, and the plans come back with nothing. And you're like, what's going on? I want this decision reviewed. And in that process, they get a different planner to make a decision based on the same evidence. And in my opinion, an S100 is usually always successful because they did make a mistake. And at any time you can have your OT decide suddenly that she needs to recommend a wheelchair. They can actually just send evidence to the NDIS, and that will trigger them to just drop that amount of funding into the plan without a review. So if a big piece of equipment was needed suddenly, you can go ahead with your existing funding and have that prescribed. Or if you needed ramps and rails put in, go ahead with your existing funding while you lodge the review. Do you know what I mean? So NDIS funding can always be used flexibly. So if there's $6,000 in capacity building, you can have $6,000 worth of podiatry if you want to, but it would be just use that flexibly to get what the participant needs so they're not at risk while the review's happening in the background, I would always say, as long as you're not leaving anyone at risk. But the review process it's a process, but it's definitely worth it. I don't know what all your experiences have been, but my participants both have 12-month plans. We know their situation is going to change and their needs will increase. But because they're on that complex team, the planner has said, just drop me a line. But if your participants aren't on the complex pathway, you do have that 21-day guarantee that they will approve the review. So if you just sort of think in your mind, I've got about a month before my funding will change, make sure you leave yourselves at least a month's worth of funding. Don't run it out. Yeah. And also on the, I will say though, if core supports run out completely and the funds are exhausted, you can call the NDIA and say the funds are exhausted, and they will trigger an immediate light touch review, LTR, and drop money in just to that category so the participant isn't at risk. So your good support coordinators should know all that, hopefully. The main thing being that the participant isn't left at risk. Yes. Everyone's
just leaving.
yeah. I thought it was a question. So yeah, so that's my knowledge of NDIS processes.
I had a quick question on sort of following on from that topic. Does anyone know, or sorry, I forgot your name, from Dementia Australia, if Dementia Australia are doing any advocacy work in terms of younger onset dementia with the NDIS, just to sort of improve knowledge about younger onset dementia and the progressive nature of the condition? And obviously everyone's individual and will have individual needs, but I think some other of the progressive neurological conditions have lobbied and you know, worked quite closely with the NDIS, so there's a good understanding, like MND or, you know, those sorts of conditions. You know, even looking at the example of autism now, that's so well understood. There's some great programs. Yeah, if anyone knows if there's anything going on at that level, so there's better understanding.
I don't know that answer, Naomi. I'm not sure from a top level of what we advocate. We do a lot of advocating work, but I'm not quite sure if it's directly with NDIS. We do have a separate dementia learning centre that does a lot of work, but that's for people that are requesting it. So from an advocacy up there, I'm not sure. I'm not the one to know. I wouldn't have a clue. So yeah.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any insight on that? Otherwise, I'll throw to Michelle. No, Michelle?
I'm just thinking, if someone has dementia and they want to access the NDIS, who would be like the first person that they would contact? Because obviously they're going to need a lot of support to fill in the forms and make, you know, those goals are often very foreign.
Yeah, so you only work out the goals once you've got your access granted. So basically, if they can't access the internet, I always say to everyone, walk in to your local area coordination service, Brotherhood of St Lawrence or La Trobe Community Health. Just walk in office hours and they'll step you through what you need to do. They can print out the forms, it's part of their role. They can direct you towards going to the GP to fill in the second section on your form. But or you can go to an NDIS counter, which is co-located at a few different Centrelink. So you'd want to do your Googling first to see which Centrelink have an NDIS counter. But if you just want to start from scratch with NDIS access, turn up in person. You can phone the line and they'll post you out the access form. And then once you've got the access form, it's really like filling in a Centrelink form: name, age, date of birth, what date did your disability start. And then the second half is to be filled in by a health professional, or you can say, see attached document and attach the geriatrician letter or whatever it is, a diagnosis letter. So there's a few options for internet savvy people and people that just need to walk in and talk to a human, which most people do. And you can phone up, and there's interpretation services and stuff as well for people with English as a second language.
Oh, that's
yeah.
great.
So all the goals and stuff
come later. Okay.
They work it out once you've been
Yeah.
approved. That's your first planning meeting. Yeah. Yeah.
And is that the OT or the local area? Who does that, or the LAC?
Local area coordinator, the LAC. Yeah, definitely.
So they kind of almost need to know how to work with somebody with dementia. And I mean, I guess hopefully if it's younger onset, there's a relatively younger family member or daughter or
someone to advocate for them in the meeting. That's really important. So the first NDIS plan though is usually just like a baby plan. It is tiny because they're waiting for all the assessments to come back in, and then they'll create a new plan for you. So, you know, if you muck it up in your first meeting, it's not awful. Like, you've got a second chance.
And Rachel, this is probably for you, Dementia Australia, do you have much information on the NDIS, or do you really just say, exactly what Joanne said, refer people to the local area coordinators?
We have an NDIS hub on our website that we direct people to, Younger Onset Dementia Hub, sorry, and that has videos that we've set up on how to apply, and then we have the links and stuff to NDIS from that. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That'll be great. Thanks.
Also in WA, the Dementia Australia offer a service through their post-diagnostic 6 sessions, and with people with younger onset dementia, they're pretty much taken up with assisting them to get to the plan meeting stage, so they'll help them.
We don't fill in forms and stuff, so we're not filling in forms in Victoria, that's for sure, but we are able to direct them how to help and which way to go and all that sort of stuff. So yeah.
And then also we have social workers, like if you get a diagnosis at the hospital, some of the hospital social workers will assist people with making their NDIS application.
Yeah, and that's definitely, social workers in hospitals are the lifeblood of new NDIS access participants, really. They do a lot of that work. And there are advocacy agencies in Melbourne, disability advocacy agencies that do assist with NDIS applications. So if you did have someone with no informal supports or a guardian or anything, there are advocacy services that will assist people to access the NDIS and attend their first meeting. Yeah. Cool bananas. And Sarah, I'm just going to ask you to, if I can, find out who everyone is afterwards, in case I ever have to run into them again and do some serious networking.
Absolutely. Do you want to go around quickly?
It's fine.
For an introduction? We've got 4 minutes.
Oh, can everyone just say who they are and who they work for? Because
hi, I'm Sarah from Caledonia Dementia Care. Rachel, you're next on my screen.
I'm Rachel from Dementia Australia.
Michelle?
I'm from Monash University, and I'm running a project looking at improving access to rehabilitation for people with dementia.
Ah, okay.
Naomi?
Hi, I'm Naomi. I'm from Brightwater Care Group in Perth, and I'm running a project about younger onset dementia services and how we can deliver them here.
Ah.
And Steph?
So I work with the Age Psych team at Eastern Health in the community, and we're getting more referrals come through for people under 65 with a dementia diagnosis. So we sort of play in this space a little bit. We sometimes get people who come to us with an NDIS plan, and it's interesting to see how everything intersects. So
yeah, I've just added in a psychiatrist from your team was very helpful with us in the last few weeks. She's gone above and beyond, I will say.
Who was that?
I can't mention names. She was amazing.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Really, really helpful, because again, it's very difficult for behaviour support practitioner and all of us on this side to get information. So she's just been amazing, really, really helpful. She actually came and did a community visit and sat at a cafe for 2 hours.
Beautiful, excellent.
And helped us so much.
I've got a very good idea who that might have been then.
But I did like beg, and I have been desperate, so it was really good.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth?
So I'm from
Was that everyone?
Oh, I think just me was the final one. I'm from VMCH, and really a lot of project work, anything to do with dementia and disability across resi aged care community and our disability services as well. Excellent. Okay, so will I be hitting you up for SIL vacancies or SDA vacancies in any of the VMCH homes? Hopefully at some point. I'm fighting hard to get something happening, but yeah, thank you so much for today. I feel like there's probably more questions. So I'm sure we'll still be in touch. Anyone can email me. I'm always happy to share knowledge. I just want good outcomes, and it's just the most difficult system to navigate. It's just the bureaucracy is. I understand it's there to protect people and everything. I understand, but still, why make it so hard? Always feel free to reach out. I'm happy to.
And I think when you start combining, and I've noticed you call it NDIA, not NDIS. Is that like a name change or something? Yeah, no. So the NDIA is the agency, so the people, and the NDIS is the scheme. So it was drummed into me very early on. When I'm referring to the funding, I usually refer to NDIS funding. Okay. And then when I'm referring to all the decision makers, I usually refer to the NDIA. Fair enough. Okay. So yeah, when you're looking at that funding and my aged care funding, together? And
So
if
I'd
you've got a
also-
family who's trying to navigate both those
So
processes.
difficult. And I do help a lot of my participants access my aged care. So usually not the participant, usually the participant's partner. I'll help them call my aged care and explain what aged care assessments are, because there's no one helping them with that either.
Yeah, it's very hard.
Terrific to meet you all. Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you,
Jo.
Jo. That was amazing. And I've written down about 4 pages of notes. And probably have
Might
a
make
lot more
sense
questions.
tomorrow. So maybe I'll just type up a little 1-pager of the key points and email it.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
That'd be absolutely wonderful.
All right.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.